Evening everyone, it's Sunday session time and today's topic is memory, which is one of the paper 1 topics in the psychology A-level. So you know the drill by now, bit of an AO1 rundown in terms of exam tips, common mistakes and things to be mindful of, and just a little bit of a coverage of what you should expect from this topic, either when revising it or if you're watching this for the first time prior to starting the memory topic, then this should give you a little bit of an insight. So I've split my little whiteboard up as usual into the different sections, starting with booklet 1. Now, hopefully you'll remember from the memory topic that booklet 1 is significantly larger than the others, and that's because it covers quite a few bullet points on the specification for this topic, and that's because it's all about the explanations of memory. So within the explanations of memory, there's actually 3 key theories that you need to know about how and why we remember things. Now, memory is very much built on the principle of cognitive psychology. So if you remember back to the approaches topic, and if you need a little refresher, go watch the revision blast video that I did on approaches. Cognitive approach is all about theoretical models and computer models and looking at internal mental processes like memory, perception and attention. And cognition is all about our thoughts and how they work. And kind of 2 out of the 3 explanations that we'll look at in a second are very much using that theoretical model where they provide a visual representation of the steps and stages involved in internal mental processes. So you can see I've drawn a little diagram alongside my description just to show you how you might also draw or visually represent this information, because that's one of the kind of first exam tips that I would say for the memory topic, is that if you get an essay question or any sort of AO1 and kind of knowledge-based questions on either the multi-store or the working memory model, if you find that you're running out of time or you're struggling to think of how to construct your response, the first thing that I would do, my answer, is draw the model out. Not only does it provide a really accurate and detailed plan, which hopefully then should help you construct your answer, but it also means that if you've got a detailed and labelled diagram, if you run out of time, you can still gain AO1 marks from your diagram. So always draw them alongside your written response. So the first model that we'll look at is the multi-store model of memory. Now, this was developed by Atkinson and Shiffrin in 1968. Now, this, as it says in the name, is a multi-store model. So it includes multiple stores and covers all 3 areas of memory, that being sensory memory, short-term and long-term memory. Now, the key thing to remember with the multi-store model is that this suggests that memory is unitary, and therefore each of the different stores are separate and work independently of each other. However, they do have this linear nature in which information must be processed in the first store before it is able to move to the second store effectively. So the first store is a sensory register or sensory memory. That's the part of our memory that takes in that initial information from the environmental stimuli. So using our 5 senses, we take in information from the environment about what we see, what we hear, what we can taste, touch, smell, and it processes them mainly visually, so what we call iconically, or based on sound, so echoically. And it processes them very quickly in about a duration of about half a second, but it has a very, large capacity. We can take in a lot of information at once, but it is only information that you pay attention to that actually then makes it to that next store of the short-term memory. So you'll notice on the kind of diagram or visual representation, there's a series of arrows. Those arrows indicate how the information is travelling from one store to another. So it's essential that you are including the processes of each store, not just what information is present. So when information makes it to the short-term memory, you need to be able to talk about 3 key bits of information for all of the stores here. That being the duration, the capacity and the coding. Duration obviously refers to how long the information can be held. Coding refers to the format or the way in which the information is processed and held, and capacity is about how much, how many items at once can be held in that store. So short-term memory has a capacity of approximately 5 to 9 items. So Miller kind of coined this magic number 7, and said most people's memory is roughly around 7 plus or minus 2, which is what gives us that 5 to 9 range. The duration is 18 to 30 seconds. So that was researched by Peterson and Peterson, who did a key study with trigrams to try and identify how long could people hold information for. And then finally the coding, which was investigated by Baddeley, and found that the coding in this store is acoustic. So that suggests that we process information based on sound, and how things sound. From Baddeley's key study, they found that participants actually, when they were given a list of words, either acoustically similar words, so words that had the same sound, acoustically dissimilar words, so word lists where the words didn't have any kind of meaning, semantically similar words, so words that all had the same meaning and were synonyms of each other, like big, large, huge, colossal, and then semantically dissimilar words. So 4 different word groups. Now, this same study by Baddeley can actually be used to talk about the coding of both short-term memory and long-term memory. The only difference is when the recall was actually tested. So in that study, when participants' recall was tested immediately, so testing for short-term coding, it was found that they actually struggle with the acoustically similar words. Now, it's important not to get muddled here. The fact that they've struggled with the acoustic words suggests that we must process things acoustically, because when the material is too similar sounding, we don't have that ability to differentiate between the material, and therefore we get muddled. So the sounding of the material must be essential to how we remember and how we code it in that short-term memory. When the same set of word lists were tested on participants 20 minutes later, so after a delayed period of time, this was now testing for the long-term memory, because remember, short-term only has a duration of up to 30 seconds. Anything past that then becomes long-term memory. And when they were tested in the long-term memory, they found that participants really struggled to recall the semantically similar words. So this is words with the same meaning. And again, that's because the way that the word is processed determines whether or not we remember it. So if we're trying to remember lots of words that all mean the same thing, there's nothing to help us differentiate between the material, and it becomes muddled. So in short term, it's coded acoustically. In long term, it's coded semantically. And you can use that same research study by Baddeley to help you explain both. Just make sure you're using those buzzwords of immediately for short term or 20 minutes later when talking about the long term memory. And then finally, when it gets into long term memory, I've just obviously talked through the coding. It has a duration of up to a lifetime. So Barrick studied that with his yearbook study, where he kind of got people to look at photos from their graduating class of high school, and then over different periods of time, so after 5 years, 10 years and so on, got them to do either photo recognition tasks, so looking at the photos and trying to say the names, or free recall, so writing down the names from memory. And he found that whilst there was a decay of memory over time, most people could successfully recall the names and faces up to potentially kind of 48 to 50 years later. So in terms of the duration of long-term memory, whilst it decays over time, it's potentially up to a lifetime. And the capacity is potentially unlimited. There is no research study that you would use to describe the capacity. That's because we can't physically see inside our memory, and to test the amount that somebody can hold in their long-term memory is very, very difficult to empirically measure. So there isn't actually any scientific evidence to suggest it's unlimited. However, that is kind of an inference that we've had to make based on the available evidence that we have. Now, when information stays in the long-term memory, we can then retrieve that by recalling upon that information and bringing it back to our working memory. A few other processes that I want to mention. To keep something in our short-term memory, we must do maintenance rehearsal. So that's about going over the information over and over again, repeating it to make sure that it stays there. Once information has been repeated a lot of times, we start to elaborate meaning to it. That's what we call elaborative rehearsal. So to keep something in short term so we don't forget it, we must rehearse it, but then elaborative rehearsal must occur for it to move into our long-term memory, and only when it's there can we retrieve upon that information where needed. If we don't pay attention, information is forgotten. If we don't rehearse it, it's also forgotten as well. So these processes are very important in how the multi-store model works. Now the evaluations for that, like I said, this is mainly an AO1 video, so I'm not going to go through all the AO3 points. However, just as a reference, this is where we use a lot of key case studies of brain damage patients, such as KF, HM, Clive Waring, and you can really utilise your knowledge there to demonstrate how each case study either supports or contradicts the unitary nature of the model. So the fact that each of these three stores are separate. Now, because this is just a model of all of memory, it is a little bit vague. So along comes Baddeley and Hitch with their more in-depth study of one of the stores, and they bring the working memory model. Now, this is an in-depth theory predominantly of short-term memory. So whilst you can see on the diagram there is an element that connects to long-term, the actual theory itself is just focusing on what happens in that short-term store. So in 1974 they came up with the working memory model, which comprises of 4 key components to the working memory. So at the top you've got the central executive. This is the boss on the controller of the model, and its job is essentially to delegate information to the relevant slave systems. Similar to the multi-store model, you have to know 3 key bits of information about that. So for multi-store, it's capacity, duration and coding. For working memory, it's capacity, coding and the function, so the job or the type of information that it works with. It doesn't need duration because we're purely looking at all of short term, so everything has a limited duration. Unlike the multi-store model, there isn't set research studies that you need to know for coding capacity and duration. You just need to be able to describe it and give examples. So the central executive only has a capacity of 1 strand of information at once. So as soon as that information is processed from the environment, it quickly has to delegate that information for tasks to be successful. In terms of one of the things that it would delegate to, if it's auditory information, then it would process that to the phonological loop. So this is a temporary store for acoustic-based information and speech-based sounds. So it processes what we hear and things like reading tasks. Within the phonological loop, it has 2 ways that information is coded, and that is based on the subsystems. So the phonological store codes information that we hear, so speech-based sounds, whereas the articulatory control process is what allows us to do that subvocal repetition. So that codes information in the form of doing maintenance rehearsal. Now the capacity of this store is very limited, and it's limited to the amount of information that can be said out loud in 2 seconds. So that's what we refer to as the word length effect. Now what that kind of hints to us is that by doing things like creating acronyms and abbreviations and shortening words down, that's going to increase how much information you can rehearse in your short-term memory. Because if our capacity is only how much can be said in 2 seconds, we're unlikely to remember really long, complex words because it takes us too long to say them. But if we can shorten material down into quick words that don't take a long time to say, we can fit more words into that capacity and then rehearse it with ease. The other slave system is the visuospatial sketchpad. So as you might suggest from the name, this is a temporary store for visual and spatial information. So this is to do with the things we can physically see around us and the spatial relationships between them. So it helps with our spatial navigation and spatial awareness. Again, this is coded in 2 different ways via the subsystems. So it's got the visual cache, which processes information based on form and shape and colour. And then it's got the inner scribe. So the inner scribe deals with the spatial relationships between things. And it also helps send information back to the central executive when we're doing a complex task. Now, finally, they added the episodic buffer in, actually a little bit later till the model. It wasn't in the original version. And this is an extra storage unit, so anything that doesn't neatly fit into the phonological loop or the visuospatial sketchpad, which both have limited capacity. So, for example, visuospatial is about 3 to 4 objects. The episodic buffer again holds about 4 chunks of information, so this is some extra storage space. It also connects information to long-term memory and allows for that retrieval process. But it also helps with a sense of time sequencing and helping your working memory organise information. So when you're working out or problem solving, it helps organise the things that you've got to work out into the relevant steps. So it's quite an essential part of our working memory. And then finally, you've got research by Tulving on the types of long-term memory. So while Multistore looked at memory as a whole, Tulving identified that there were maybe different types or different stores within our long-term memory. So you've got episodic memory, which is categorised by memories that require that conscious awareness, what we call declarative memories, and they are your personal memories. So events from your life, things that have actually happened to you, such as birthdays, your wedding day, something that's significant that has a time stamp to it. So you can remember the exact moment that memory was created. You've also got non-declarative memories, such as procedural memory, which is our muscle memory, so our memory of physical skills like learning how to ride a bike. It's very much automated. Once you've developed that skill, you don't need to consciously think about doing it. Another kind of non-time stamped long-term memories, semantic memories. Now these, similar to episodic, do require that conscious recall, so they are also declarative. However, semantic memories are things like general knowledge. They're the facts about the world that you can freely learn, and that is shared information amongst everyone. So lots of people can learn the same facts and therefore share some of the same long-term memories because of that learned knowledge. Whereas episodic memory is specifically personal to you. So that's explanations of memory. If we then contrast that to booklet 2, this is explanations of forgetting. So it's the opposite in the sense of it's looking at, well, what are the reasons why we wouldn't remember something, and how might information get lost from our long-term memory? Because theoretically, we've just suggested that long-term memory is potentially unlimited, but we know that's not true because we know that people do experience forgetting or struggle to retain information. So besides physical factors like age and memory decaying over time, what are some of the reasons why information sometimes just isn't available to us? And there's 2 theories that you can look at for this one. You've got interference theory and retrieval failure. So interference theory is about the disruption of memories. So when we learn information, how it is recent or past learning interfering with information that we are trying to recall at that moment. And there's two different types. So you've got proactive interference, which is when your old memories interfere or disrupt your ability to recall new information. And then retroactive, which is when new, more recent learning disrupts or interferes with your ability to recall something older. So to give you an example, proactive interference would be if I taught you the multi-store model followed by the working memory. Proactive would be if I taught you both and then I gave you an exam question on the working memory model, so something new, and your old knowledge of multi-store interfered with your ability to answer that exam question and you got muddled and you wrote about the wrong theory. Whereas retroactive would be if I gave you an exam question on the multi-store model, that being your old learning, but your new recent learning of working memory interfere with your ability to recall something old. So instead you would get muddled and only be able to talk about working memory because that's your new recent learning. Now, the two key research studies linked to interference, you first of all got Underwood and Postman. So that's a really good study you can use when talking about retroactive interference. So that was the one to do with word lists. So participants having to either remember one set of word pairs or two, and then both groups being asked to recall the original list. And there was a much higher chance of forgetting in the group that had been taught more information because that new learning interfered with their ability to recall the original material. Another key factor about interference is that interference is more likely to occur when the information that you are learning is similar. The more similar the information, the more likely interference is to occur. And you can use McGough and McDonald's study for this one. So they got participants to look at a range of different word lists. So they learned 10 adjectives and then were given a second list to learn. And these were things such as nonsense trigrams, rhyming words, synonyms, antonyms. So the material that they learned was either similar or not similar to the original list. And they found that the group that were given the synonym list, so words that had the same meaning as the original list, they only had 12% recall ability. So they experienced significant amounts of retroactive interference because they struggled to retain that knowledge of the original list because of the similarity between the two things that they had learned. Alternatively, you've got retrieval failure. Now, this suggests that information isn't necessarily lost or forgotten from our long-term memory. It's just not available at that time, or it's not accessible. Now, Tulving came up with the encoding specificity principle to try and explain this. So retrieval failure is all about the absence of cues. It's having a lack or insufficient cues available to help with recall, and therefore without those cues, forgetting is likely to occur. So the encoding specificity principle suggests that the information that you require at the time of learning should also be present at the time of retrieval. And if those two cues match, then retrieval is likely to happen. But without that, forgetting is likely to occur. So there's two different types of cues that we can talk about here. You've got our external cues, which are more environmental, and that is called context-dependent forgetting. And then you've got your internal cues, which are more to do with your mental and physiological state, and they are called state-dependent cues or state-dependent forgetting. And again, there's a key research study for each one. So context-dependent forgetting suggests that we need to have the same environmental cues at retrieval and learning in order to be able to complete that task. The absence of contextual cues will cause forgetting to occur. So the key study for this one is Gordon and Baddeley with the divers study, so where they learn on land, learn underwater, recalled on land, recalled underwater, so that they had a mixture of different conditions, and the divers' learning environment and recall environment was either the same or different. And what they found is that it didn't matter whether you were on land or underwater, but what mattered is whether or not those two conditions matched. If the environment for learning and recall was different, there was a significant reduction in recall ability and forgetting was higher. So there was a 40% reduction in how many words the participants could remember if the two contexts were different, suggesting that context-dependent forgetting occurs when there is a lack of environmental cues. Alternatively, Goodwin researched state-dependent forgetting with a similar study where participants were given information to learn, and then their physical and mental state was either the same or different at learning versus recall. So in this one, they looked at the effects of substances like alcohol to see if your physiological state would play a role. So participants either learned material drunk or sober, and then recalled it either drunk or sober. And again, they found that when the two internal states matched for recall and learning, then forgetting was less likely to occur. When that state was different, there was an absence of internal cues, and that's what caused retrieval failure. Now, an easy evaluation point for that, again, not going through the AO3 now, but that a lot of the information from the research studies for forgetting is very much based on lab experiments and artificial material. There's not a lot of realistic research evidence that will suggest that these things are relevant to real life. So, for example, Gordon and Baddeley's diver study, those two contexts are completely, extremely different. It's very unlikely you can generalise that same idea to learning in one classroom and recalling in another. Okay, so that's an easy evaluation point to bear in mind when talking about interference or retrieval failure, is the methodology that's been used around those studies. As we then move on to the next section, so booklet 3, this is factors affecting the accuracy of eyewitness testimony. So eyewitness testimony is where we're using our memory in a more realistic setting, this time in a court of law. So by definition, this is referring to when somebody gives evidence either in a courtroom or a police station about a crime that they have witnessed or heard about, and this is then often used to help give evidence towards those cases. Now, what we look at in this booklet is what are the things that potentially could make somebody's eyewitness statement, so their memory of an accident or crime they've witnessed, what is something that could make that potentially inaccurate? Because a lot of research has suggested that when crimes are committed and people are put to trial, a lot of people get falsely accused of crimes just based on evidence from eyewitness testimony alone. So we need to look at what are the problems with eyewitness testimony and kind of false memories, and what are the things we can do to improve that. So there's 3 main factors that affect the accuracy of eyewitness testimony. You've got leading questions, post-event discussion and anxiety. Now, leading questions and post-event discussion both come under the same kind of umbrella term of misleading information. So this is information that is presented to the witness kind of immediately after the crime or in the period of time after that could affect how well they remember. So leading questions are questions, because of the way that they are phrased, could lead you to give a certain response. So the key studies that you would use to help you describe leading questions, for example, is Loftus and Palmer with their original car crash study about estimating the speeds of the car crash depending on the wording of the question, in which they found that when participants were asked how fast in miles per hour were the cars going when they smashed into each other, that kind of led participants to believe the speed was much higher, and the group had a higher estimated speed when the verb used in the question was very severe, compared to a less severe verb like contacted, in which case participants thought that the cars weren't going as fast and gave a lower estimate. They also had a study about the broken glass. So similar to their original car crash study, they replicated this, except a week later, they asked participants, did you see any broken glass in the car accident? And they found that not only can leading questions influence our responses and mislead us to say things that we maybe don't quite remember, this actually shows that the people who thought that the car was going faster, so the group who estimated smashed, were likely to say there was broken glass even when there wasn't any. So that also provides evidence that misleading information could also lead to false memories. Now, post-event discussion, on the other hand, is a different type of misleading information, because this isn't about how the witness is questioned. This is about what happens if the witness is allowed to discuss what they have seen with other people present. So this is about kind of similar to social influence in how we are influenced by others, but this time how that discussion with other people can genuinely distort and change your memory and what you think you have and haven't seen. And the key research study for that section you would use is Gabbert et al. The final factor, and this is kind of separate from misleading information. So if you've got a question on misleading information as a factor affecting eyewitness testimony, you could talk about leading questions or post-event discussion. Equally, there is enough evaluation points that those factors could be asked separately on an essay, but more often than not, they do kind of go together. Anxiety, however, is separate. And when talking about the role that anxiety plays, you need to be able to talk about how this can contribute positively, negatively, and then what is that kind of nice medium balance in terms of improving our eyewitness testimony. So there's a key research study for the negative effects of eyewitness testimony, and this comes from Johnson and Scott. So their study suggested that if we are too anxious, we're going to become really overwhelmed by the scenario and we're going to be less accurate in our eyewitness statement. So anxiety and having a heightened sense of emotion can actually decrease how accurate we are, because we become overwhelmed by the stimuli and we struggle to focus on the details of the surrounding, and instead are affected sometimes by what we call the weapon focus effect, where we focus on the central details such as a weapon, rather than looking at the perpetrator's face or any of the peripheral details of the environment that might often be useful in a case. Alternatively, you've got a research study by Yulee and Cutshall, which looked at the positive effect of anxiety, how in some cases anxiety can actually make us more alert and more aware, and that those who report feeling really anxious at the time of witnessing a crime, when it comes to them giving their report, they tend to be a lot more accurate. So there's kind of evidence or kind of research evidence out there to suggest anxiety can have both positive and negative impacts on our memory. But the Yerkes-Dodson's law suggests that if we have the right amount of anxiety, so what we call the optimum level, where we're anxious enough that we are paying attention and we're very alert of our surroundings, but not so anxious that it starts to impact our recall, that optimum level of moderate anxiety, it creates that inverted U hypothesis. So I'm not sure if you can see on my little diagram here, so it kind of looks like a bell curve shape. And this is the idea that the more anxious that we get, our accuracy of eyewitness testimony increases, but only to a certain point. If it then tips over into that kind of extreme anxiety level, then accuracy starts to decrease. So by having that appropriate level, that's what the best recall is going to include. And then finally, following on nicely from booklet 3, you've got booklet 4, which is all about improving the accuracy of eyewitness testimony. And this is what we refer to as the cognitive interview. Now, within the cognitive interview, there's 4 main techniques or 4 main components that researchers have developed as a way of interviewing people to get the best possible recall and to minimise things like retrieval failure or the use of schemas to fill in blanks in our memory. So we use the acronym of CROP to help us remember the components. The first component being context reinstatement. So this is getting the witness to recall any information about the weather, the environment, how they were feeling, and just anything at all about the context of the scenario that could then possibly help with context-dependent forgetting and act as a retrieval cue to improve memory. Similarly, to improve recall, you might also get them to report everything. Again, it's about providing those triggers, those potential retrieval cues to aid recall by getting them to tell you everything about that day, even if it doesn't seem important. So the more trivial, the better. You've then got order of recall. So this is about changing the order in which you ask witnesses to talk about what they've seen. So rather than getting them to talk from the start of the day to the end in a traditional order, you might ask them to start at the end or start at the middle and work their way through. Now that's to prevent the use of schemas in our memory from filling in blanks. So if there's any part that we forget or we're struggling to recall, what our memory might do is try and fill in those blanks by thinking, well, what do we normally do? For example, on a Tuesday, we get up at this time, we go for a coffee, we go to work, and kind of fills in the blanks with your typical routine and schedule, which is often where misremembering occurs and people start to create those false memories. Another thing to help with minimising the use of schemas is changing perspective. So this is getting the witness to recall information from what they think somebody else might have seen. So get them to imagine that they're in somebody else's shoes, they maybe stood in a different position, like somebody from across the other side of the street or the other side of the room, and try to imagine and envision what they potentially might have seen. Alongside that, you've got the enhanced cognitive interview. So the cognitive interview is the actual interview technique. The enhanced version is kind of a set of social rules or conventions that go alongside delivering the cognitive interview. So when using these 4 techniques, there's kind of 5 key things that you can remember to do that can allow your witness to feel comfortable and to further improve their recall. And that includes things such as speaking slowly, giving your witness eye contact, because that helps with trust and building a rapport and shows that you're really intently listening and taking what they're saying seriously. Using open-ended questions to allow them to elaborate on their responses and avoid that risk of leading questions. You want to minimise distractions, so to make sure that there is nothing else in that environment or that they can hear that might be distracting them during the scenario. You want them to be really focused during questioning so they can think about that recall. And finally, you want to reduce anxiety. You want to make them feel as comfortable as possible. So building that rapport really helps with establishing that boundary and level of trust to make the witness more likely to share information and to help with that recall. Because of what we know from the impacts of how anxiety can affect eyewitness testimony, we want to make sure that they're at that nice moderate level and that they're not going into that threshold where they start to decrease in their accuracy. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a whistle-stop tour of the memory topic in terms of the key studies, the researchers' names, kind of key terminology and things that you need to remember. Next up in the series, we've got attachment, and that will kind of finish the paper 1 topics and then allow me a little bit of time to start planning ahead and looking at paper 3 videos regarding relationships, schizophrenia, aggression and issues and debates, which will be posted kind of at the end of each week over the coming weeks. But again, don't forget to like and subscribe, pop some comments down below. I've just made the channel public so that you are able to interact with it a little bit more in terms of giving me some feedback on what you want to see. And again, check out the college Instagram for direct links to the videos and reminders of when they are live. Okay, so good luck with revising. Year 13, you've got this. Year 12, hopefully we're enjoying the topic so far, and this will give you a little bit of a insight into what's to come for the rest of the topic, and some pointers for your next assessment. Thanks, guys.